So I'm going to talk to everyone today about something that I'm very passionate about. It's the kind of the combination of how businesses scale and the culture and how to think about culture as that happens. And some great questions earlier. Lots of entrepreneurs here, lots of people starting businesses. I'm sure a few people have even gotten to the stage where they're actually building and growing their businesses. So some of this will be relevant to things you've experienced, things that you're going through now. Some of it may actually hopefully stretch you into thinking about things that you might go into the future. And I'm hoping that I can just impart with you some of the experiences that I've had that can help you think about, you know, how scale happens, what are the changes in the business, what are the changes in culture. That's me, and I think it's combined with that, so that's that picture. Past that real quick. So what do I hope you gain from this? Building businesses is complex. It's a whole bunch of problems and hurdles that you have to face, and they're ever changing. You know, you solve one thing, the next day you have another problem. So as the landscape changes, as the organization changes, I'm basically hoping that you can take some of the experiences that I'm going to share with you and use those to think about how it relates to your particular situation. Everyone's situation is unique and different, so there's never going to be an exact parallel example. But what I've tried to do is I've tried to take some pretty standard generalities on the things that are common and share them with you so that we can kind of talk about, have a conversation about what it looks like as you grow a business. So I've broken down the business growth stage into 4 key segments. Founding is like the very early stage, you know, setting up with your co-founders, figuring out how things work, getting your MVP, getting a business kind of off the ground. Funding is when you've actually now been able to go out and get funding, and now you're at a stage where you're thinking about some level of scale. Growing is where you've got multiple rounds of funding, and now resources are less of an issue for you. You have the money you need to actually do the things you need to do. And then maturing is the point at which we kind of all think about as the end game of, you know, now this is a self-supportive, large, mature organization. And so I'm going to go run through each one of these real quickly with you and just talk about some of the differences and some of the stages of growth and organizational structures that are implemented in that stage of the business. And I'll give you a couple of case studies from DigitalOcean that we experienced as we've kind of gone through that process. And then at the end, I'm going to come back, I'm going to talk to you about a construct around culture and something that is a really good way to think about culture as you grow between these stages. So founding is, you know, the first part of business, very, very ad hoc. Essentially, you know, 0 to 20 people, let's say, is a kind of average size of this, but even as you get north of 10, 15 people, in a lot of cases, you need, you know, some kind of funding. So it's probably 5 to 10 people in most cases. You have limited options. You don't have many resources. You generally work within a flat organization. So as many of you all know who've started companies and work with co-founders, no one has a title, no one has a particular role. You have some speciality you're good at, but everybody lends a hand in everything. And so it requires kind of a broad set of expertise. It requires an ability to do a whole bunch of different things, a very unique type of person to be able to actually be part of a founding team. What works? It's cost efficient, it's cost effective. You're essentially doing the work of 50 people between 5 people, and you know, nothing is more cost effective than that. Most times people are working for equity rather than for cash, and so you have the ability to do a significant amount more with a lot less money. It's efficient. You're, you know, usually sitting around a table or directly connected. You're communicating directly. It's like a really easy way to kind of work with people hand in hand and actually get things done very quickly. And it's very scrappy. You will hack things, you will take shortcuts, you'll do whatever you need to do to get that product into the state that you need to put it out to market and see if it actually works and gets gets attention from your audience. But the things that you have to be careful about is accountability, reliability. You got to make sure that your team is 100% there with you. If you have a weak link in that team with 4 or 5 people and you're stretched thin, that is going to be a huge problem and difficulty. And anybody that's had a bad co-founder in their business knows this 100%. And you have to be very clear about the balance of responsibilities. Who owns what? Who's doing what? What is someone's capabilities versus other people's capabilities? And make sure those things are clear, because in the founding stages of a business, a lot of people get, you know, misguided in terms of where their real skill is, and they feel like they should be somewhere else, but that's not where they should be. So there's some kind of organizational control, and you know, and general understanding of who's really focused on what area. And you just got to be ready. You're not going to have the depth you need. So when you think about the type of people you're starting with, if you go get a, you know, McKinsey consultant, you know, nothing against McKinsey consultants, or you know, a big company person who is very deep and focused in a particular area of expertise, they're going to have a much harder time spreading thin, and they're going to have a much harder time accepting the lack of depth you have in every core focus. You're going to be running, you know, your finances off of a Google sheet. You're going to be running, you know, you're going to be doing things that are going to make, you know, the accountant in that regard feel really, you know, sick to the stomach, but that's what you have to do to get through. And so the type of people you're working with are people who are generalists, people who have the capability to do a whole slew of things. You know, when we touch on culture in this type of organization, culture is the founders. It's the dynamic and the relationship that the founders have with each other. If you guys work well together and work dynamically together, you are going to have a good culture. It's going to be a good working team. There are a lot of examples of founders that fight tooth and nail, but that sometimes is not poison, sometimes that's magic. And so don't always think that a founding team that looks like they're completely dysfunctional are actually, you know, crazy. I'll give you one great example of that is Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz. I mean, they are known to fight tooth and nail, and they currently have the #1 VC firm in Silicon Valley, and they've both had incredible performance in their past partnerships. And they literally are known to be the most abusive partners to each other that you can imagine. But, you know, sometimes you find magic in that. It's a thin line to tread, because if it is poisonous, and that can kill the relationship, and that can kill the business very, very quickly. So I wanted to give you a quick example of what this looks like in reality. So this is DigitalOcean's founding team. Ben and Moisey are brothers. They were kind of the leaders, and they started the whole thing. Moisey was the product visionary. Ben was kind of the leader and the CEO type of person. And they had their mad scientists. They had their usability person building the whole front end. They had their branding whiz and Mitch, who was kind of building the whole brand. The shark you see and everything you see in our brand came from him. And they were missing this whole segment of kind of controls and like there was a definite thing, you know, piece of the puzzle they didn't have. And at one point I stepped in, and that's where I started working with them. But ultimately, you know, this team of 5 people figured out how to build what is now, you know, a couple $100 million business hosting 420,000 customers globally. And they figured out how to do that in a pretty short space of time. But is this the team that runs that? And, you know, based on what I said before, this is where they are today. The only person that's still in the position that they were in from the beginning is Ben. He's the CEO. Moisey is still involved, but as a board member and an advisor. He's not involved day to day. Mitch is still involved in the marketing team, but he's director of brand. He works, you know, within a marketing organization. Jeff has moved on to his next startup. Alec actually moved to a different industry. And the reason these changes have happened, they all happened over a period of time, is because at some point in the growth of the business, they were not suited for the specialization and the stuff we're going to talk through over the next couple of segments. And what did this team turn into? It turned into this. And this is only part of the team. The team grows to the left here, but a pretty formalized structure. And as we go into kind of the growth phase, you're going to see this reflected in the organizational chart. But a formal structure of really deep focused people that are very, you know, tens of years of experience each in terms of just their speciality and their different subject matters. And so that's kind of speaks to the evolution. Never, you know, you're in a team, you're founding a company, you're doing what you're passionate about. You might end up being one of these people, but there's a very good chance you might end up stepping away, or you might end up taking a role within one of these teams. And that's not anything to be concerned about. Sure. In general, let me just say, we'll try and keep the questions to the end, but I'm happy to ask us. Okay,
yeah. So where's the CTO role in this?
Oh, the CTO role is there. It just goes along. I couldn't fit the whole team. I just wanted to kind of set the setup. But yes, there's definitely a CTO. And we have a VP of engineering, a VP of product, VP of infra. We have a lot of technical leaders. So that just kind of illustrates the change between that founding state and the future state, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So now you're getting funding. So with funding, you have the ability to grow. And I've kind of framed it as a 20 to 200 person organization, but you're still very limited. You know, you may get a Series A, you may get a Series B, but very often it's not enough money to do what you really want to do. So you don't have as clean a, you know, you don't immediately go to this like professional, verticalized, you know, deep focus structure. What you have is a structure called a flatter structure. So the first ad hoc structure was flat. Everybody was exactly the same. A flatter structure does start to introduce levels. But what it does is it has levels, each of which are very cross-functional. So your leadership team at the top is still running the company as a whole. You have a layer in between of kind of middle management that is still helping and working with each other horizontally. And you have an organization of individual contributors underneath who, again, still all working together. A lot of cross-functional capabilities, a lot of cross-functional effort. And the reason is because, you know, you build a team of 50 people, your company might inherently need 200, 300, 400 people to really be able to fulfill all the functions that your company needs. You just can't do that. You don't have the resources. So you're still thinking about how to create an efficient operation. And again, the founders I find in this stage often are still very valuable and very capable because they have this cross-functional capability. In some cases, you start needing to introduce more structure in your engineering department, in certain pieces of the business where it's very important to start creating structure. And that's where you might start seeing founders say, hey, I'm not into the structure, I like the ad hoc org, you know, I've done what I've done, I have my equity, I'm going to move and start my next thing. And that's fine. So what does this really do? You now are able to create some level of specialization. As I said, there's still a lot of cross-function. And your employees, even though you have some level of speciality, they still have a certain generalization. It is flatter because you still don't really have multiple levels. You kind of have a management layer and you have an IC layer, and you haven't organized your team into multiple layers of expertise and capability. Everyone is generally considered to be part of the same. Every engineer is an engineer. You don't have senior engineers or staff engineers. You just generally have engineers. What works is still cost effective because you're still kind of scrappy. You're still, you know, making things work. You're more effective than you were as a founding team because now you've just got a deeper bench, but you're still, you know, trying to get to a resolve without actually having the full resources you need to do it. Fluid communication, people are working across, you know, people are kind of moving from function to function as demand is needed and helping out wherever is needed. And it's really still very, very collaborative environment. You don't have these isolated, no one's in a glass cube and, you know, no one's in a private room. You still have a very collaborative environment. It's still small enough to be able to handle that. But as a founder, for example, you have to start thinking about loosening control. You have to allow people to run with projects. There is a point in every founder's life where the business just suddenly crosses that barrier where it's one person too big to just be involved in everything. You know, at the beginning you want to be involved in absolutely everything, but there comes a point where you've got to say, you know what, you've got this, I trust you, you take care of it. I don't have time to do everything that I thought I was doing before. And there is some level of conflict here. You still have leaders, you know, the founders especially, are still trying to find their feet. Where are they going to land? Where exactly do they fit in this organization? And as a result of that, there can be conflicting decisions. There can be some conflict. Now it's not just 5 people sitting around the table making every decision. Now you're running actual, you know, groups of 5, 10 people teams. And if someone is going in a certain direction that's not aligned with the others, you start seeing the introduction of conflict in that regard. And be sure you're still going to have a huge lack of process and controls. Some people are effective in building agile processes into this, but usually you need a little bit more maturity to get to a point where you can really run efficient processes and controls. You're still kind of doing things by the seat of your pants a little bit, trying to make sure you get to the next stage. So culturally, this is the first big transition, obviously. You're not 5 people around a room. Now you have to drive a culture of people that are coming into your environment. A lot of it is centered around how you hire those people, and a lot of it is centered around how you act around those people. And so you're really building that team culture. Communication, you have to think about that a little bit. It's more people. You can't just sit in the back room and make decisions. Everything really has to be very open and communicated. But the structure of communication will change a little bit. And you can have, you know, you do have the risk that if you start getting a couple of superstar engineers, you start seeing resentment from, because everybody's in somewhat still a flat group, you start seeing resentment from of them from them of like lesser qualified engineers. You start seeing these kinds of shifts where there can be problems culturally in terms of how people work together and how this thing starts actually operating. So there are cultural concerns here that you have to really start thinking about. At this point, it's still manageable, and you still kind of, as a good leader and a good founder, you can still really drive culture and how it works. You know, a case study of this, a hurdle that we went through. So we scaled in 2014 from 20 people to 120 people. So that's a 6x scale in a matter of a year. And one thing to note in scaling is it's not just hiring 100 people. It's those 100 people have to be onboarded and trained by the people you have. So you hire someone 1 month, and 2 months later, they're training the next person. Or a month later, they're training the next person. So how good are you training that person to allow them to train the next person? What are you including in the training? Is culture involved in the training? Because if it's not, then whoever's coming in is going to create their own culture and create their own cultural environment. So it's really, if you don't do it with a plan, you can end up in trouble. And that's basically what we did. We didn't do it with a plan. There was this big rush. We just got a bunch of money. We need to go hire a whole bunch of heads. You know, there were definitely different camps in the founding group. I was on the camp saying, hey, let's have a plan for this. There was a whole other camp which was like, no, we just need to hire people and build an organization. And what ended up happening is, you know, as you can predict, we got really high attrition. Our top talent all, by the end of the year, everyone was excited to join because it was a big, you know, brand was really getting popular and developers loved us and everybody wanted to be a part of it. So hiring the people wasn't difficult. But we suddenly had all these isolated groups of people that didn't really get onboarded properly, weren't really circled into the culture properly. You had a few people we found that were really great talent that we thought we had to have, but now they were working with people that were probably not as good and leveled at the same level as them and just getting frustrated by it. So now we were losing talent. So attrition went up, we were losing top talent, productivity went through the floor. You had engineers who just couldn't work together. There was no real organizational structure. It was just this ad hoc cloud of engineers. So everybody was like, well, I'm going to work on whatever I want to work on. And they were trying to figure out what they could work on, what they could do. And it was basically just a bit of a mess. So what's ended up happening is there was no productivity. We start just building tech debt, but no productivity. And the product suffered in a big way. So in that first year, we were literally living off the valuable work that was done by the founders the year before. And we were just focused on trying to kind of keep our head above water while we were taking on a lot of customers and building a, you know, reasonable business over that period of time. So what did we do? When we came into 2015, there were 3 things that we started doing. So we really hit our kind of the bottom in the end of 2014 from a cultural perspective. And so we decided let's you know, structure this, let's formulate this, let's start moving to this next stage of organizational design and start thinking about culture. So we improved communications. First thing was we had 100, 120 people in this organization and nobody was communicating properly. No one knew the vision. No one understood the objectives. No one understood the key results or KPIs they were going after. No one knew what was expected from them. So we introduced a whole bunch of communication techniques. We introduced what we called AMAs, Ask Me Anythings. Every 2 weeks, we would get up, we'd bring the whole company together, and we would just literally have them throw whatever question they want at us. And we just basically worked and hacked through those questions and started creating a methodology of delivering to the company what the vision is, what it is that we were trying to do, how we were trying to build the business. We established a cultural steering committee. So we went across the organization and found the most influential, culturally influential people in the company and put them together as a steering committee, no leaders, no founders, no executives in it, and had them basically test the temperature of the company and begin to build strategies and plans on how we can actually rebuild the culture of the business. So we kind of put it in the hands of the employees to do that. And we were very specific about communicating the vision. Even though everyone came in and was like, oh, I'm going to be working at DigitalOcean, isn't it great? Everyone knew, yes, we're hot right now, but what are we building towards? What are we trying to become? And this was something that was the unifying factor that was able to get everybody aligned and everybody to start thinking about building the same things and thinking about the same problems. we clearly defined structure. We created a flatter organization at that point, so we didn't have multiple levels in engineering or anything, but what we did do is we did introduce the concept of senior engineers, just as a single level up to say, here are the engineers that we recognize as being more experienced and more capable, and because of the respect they already had in the organization, the engineers, the general level engineers all respected that, and it actually worked very, very well. It created some level of introduction of technical leadership within the group. We created a manager program. We allowed some of the engineers to start thinking about moving into management. Not all of it was successful. Some since have gone back to being ICs, but a couple of them have become actually very good managers over time and have grown with the organization. And we started to build horizontal teams initially to say, hey, here's a team that's going to work on all of the back-end systems, all the back-end infrastructure systems. Here's the team that's going to work all the front-end systems and all the UI and the customer-facing systems here. And so we started creating these horizontal groups that had more of a focus of the things that they were focused on. And we had those groups basically end up doing handovers to each other. We weren't big enough to create vertical groups at that point, for like a vertical group for compute or a vertical group for storage. So we just created these horizontal groups so that we could do more work with less people and then have them work in a more defined way. And we improved the vision and alignment. Basically, we built objectives for the company. We distributed around the company so that everybody understood the objectives. We created goals for all the teams, and we defined key performance indicators. And basically, by this, people could actually start seeing, are they doing the right thing? Are they building the right thing? It started to introduce the beginnings of some structure to how people thought about the work that they were doing. So what comes next? So you're not just a startup anymore. Now you're growing. You've probably raised more funding. You've probably got revenue. You're in a position where you're actually building a real business. I mean, this is an exciting time for everybody. You've probably gone north of 200 people. You really are kind of moving to the next stage of your evolution. Again, things change a lot. So the structure here is a hierarchical structure. So this structure is actually very, very defined and much more organized than anything we've talked about before. The leadership at the top is still somewhat cross-functional. So the VP and C-level leadership is still going to be somewhat cross-functional. But pretty much your verticals are very clearly defined. You're going to have an engineering vertical. You're going to have a product vertical. You're going to have a marketing vertical. You're going to have very clearly defined verticals. And you're, at this point, able to really find deep expertise in each one of those verticals to run and build those verticals. So your leadership now isn't just this generalized cross-functional leadership. You're actually starting to create very, very specified skill sets. Resources aren't really as much of a problem for you anymore because now you've got the capital to support them. So yes, there's always going to be constraints, but it's nothing like it was, before you got, to this level of business. So there's centralized leadership, there's verticalized structures. As a result, now you're able to really create defined teams. You have teams for very specific projects, very specific activities. You can create growth paths and development paths for everybody. You start actually developing a really complex environment where every individual knows where they live in the organization and knows how they can grow in the organization. And it is quite complex. It takes a lot of management to do that and a lot of oversight to do that. But at the end of the day, what it does is it allows you to actually start scaling and really growing. When you've got the structure in place, now you can start adding teams as you like. You can start building different segments of the organization as you need. It just gives you a lot of power to grow. What works is you've got really focused leadership. You've got people who are specialists and experts in their field, which means the level of work you're going to do is going to go up significantly. It is really, every time you hire someone at every stage of the business, you think, wow, I just got the best person I could possibly get. When you get to the next stage of the business, you realize, oh my God, there's a better person and there's better people. You're always thinking about the next stage up, the next level up of capabilities in terms of the teams you have. Yeah, as I said, ownership is defined around key results. So each of these leaders is really owning the results that they're delivering for the business. And this really supports scale. But what's the risk? So the risk is now you're introducing process. And process inherently has bureaucracy. So when this again starts separating you from what a founder loves versus what you need in this level of a business. So the most frustrating thing for every founder is bureaucracy. I'm here to do my job. I just want to make a difference. I just want to go get things done. If I have to go through 10 steps of process to do it a certain way, that's just going to annoy me. And that honestly becomes an imperative part of this process, because if you have 300, 400 people that are just doing whatever they want, it's a complete mess. And so you have to start implementing a lot of process. That introduces bureaucracy. You need to give people autonomy. So as a leader, if you're starting a company, this is the hardest part to let go of. There came a point, I believe, up until 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, that Ben, our CEO, interviewed every single person we hired. And that's just not tenable anymore. You can't do that. And moreover, the leaders that we hire are so senior that they don't want the CEO interviewing every junior person that they hire. They just want to have the ability to run their team. So as a founder, as an entrepreneur, you have to start thinking about handing off a lot of that responsibility. You're providing a lot more autonomy. You do lose efficiency. You now have to really double down in terms of the resource commitment you're making to certain projects and activities. And you have the risk of losing alignment and collaboration. You have these different vertical groups that are kind of doing their own thing, and you have to work very well at the top to make sure that all of those groups are all moving in this, in the same direction, all able to work together and do stuff together. And the one really painful thing, and I'm sure it's very painful for me, I'm sure it's very painful for everyone here, is your innovation will slow down. You're not going to be as effective at this stage in innovating and creating new things as you were when you were a 5 or 10 or 50 person company, because the control and the process that comes into everything forces you to take a breath before you jump in. Imagine this point, this is where we are, we have 400,000 customers. If we innovate as much as we can, but if we just randomly threw things out there like we did 3 years ago and something broke, that's 420,000 customers that rely on us for their full infrastructure. We cannot take that risk. So it forces us to slow down and take a breath. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does affect that kind of entrepreneurial starter mindset in terms of just wanting to be able to go out there, break things quickly, and move on. Cultural impact. There's a real risk that leadership at this point gets isolated from the organization. It happens a lot where this segment of the organization is in a room doing all of the leadership meetings, making decisions on direction, and the rest of the organization feels like, hey, it's them against us. That's something you have to be really, really attentive to. So you have to make sure as your organization grows that you create tentacles into that organization, you're able to continue to maintain a relationship. And it's something we struggle with a lot is, how do we always make sure that the organization trusts leadership and make sure the organization feels like we've got everybody's best interests at heart. And it takes a lot of communication effort to do that. If you're not driving the culture, you can lose control of the culture. So if you're not actively putting in cultural programs, the reality is the people you hire, the teams you build are going to build their own culture. Worst case scenarios where you actually start seeing different pockets of culture in different parts of the organization, that can seriously be a death knell, because then you have organizational teams that cannot work together because culturally they just completely clash. So you have to really be very determined and focused on building culture. And recruiting and onboarding is all part of that process. This all becomes part of a plan. It's not just random or ad hoc. It all becomes a process and organized. So as a hurdle, as an example, I wanted to kind of point to here. In 2016, we scaled beyond 200 full-time employees. Now we're around 400, and we're continuing to grow. We had a flatter organization. We didn't have really true hierarchies, and we started seeing a lot of small problems kind of, again, reintroducing themselves as cultural issues for us that we needed to deal with. So we had scaling issues because of the horizontal structure we had didn't really allow as much for us to continue to add and grow teams. It wasn't as scalable as we wanted to be. So as a result, we weren't able to get the talent we always wanted. We didn't have the structure to fit people in. There was definitely some problems at this stage of the business that we were facing. So we did, again, 3 key things. We changed the organizational structure to this new one, and we went through a couple of key principles. We created a tiered management structure whereby we had multiple layers of management. It wasn't just a single layer now. We had directors, we had managers, we're introducing senior managers, senior directors, and it allows us to build much more effective teams. there's a general rule guideline. You always want to have 2 pizza teams, which means basically as long as your team can share 2 pizzas, then it's the right size of team. If they have small appetites, then you could probably put more people in there, but if you have large appetites, it's going to be a smaller team. But at the end of the day, if they can share 2 pizzas, which is basically 8 to 10 people, then you're going to have a good sized team. That team can be effective. If you get teams that end up being 15, 20, 30 people, they're not going to be effective teams. So that's part of the reason why you need a tiered structure to be able to support that. The functions and the vertical teams, team aggregation, like, you can really be focused now. You can have a team that's dealing with one very, very specific issue, and they can live and own that issue for years to come. And so you're able to really start building teams as you define and determine the exact projects and exact issues you want to build. We started introducing levels, so now we have multiple levels. We have 5 levels at on the IC side, and we have 5 levels on the manager side. We're actually moving to 7 levels in each. Same thing Google has, same thing Facebook has. And what this does is this allows us to actually start creating much more detailed career paths for people. So rather than just being a senior engineer or a regular engineer, now there's staff engineers, there's senior staff engineers, there's multiple layers of engineering. And that not only gives your existing employees the ability to grow, but now opens up the opportunity for you to go and, you know, recruit people from Google or recruit people from, you know, some of these major organizations that have these lofty big titles because they've earned them. You know, they built them over years of experience. And this is where you start understanding that, hey, the best engineer I ever hired is nothing compared to the next best engineer that I'm going to be hiring. And that's, you know, an exciting opportunity for people to build their teams. Technical leadership becomes a, you know, an opportunity. Development pathing I already talked about. And then senior vertical leaders. As I said, what we started doing is we started hiring real specialists in engineering, specialists in product, marketing, VP of people, like all these key specialists that actually brought a whole wealth of experience that as founders or as early executives, none of us had. And even though, you know, as a founder, you feel like, hey, I know this better than anybody, I can do this better than anybody. When you start bringing in those types of people, you realize that, you know what, there are some people that really know stuff that I have no idea about. And you have to really trust them to get their job done. So that's basically what we did to kind of go through that level. The final stage is maturing. And I'm only going to touch on this because I think it's kind of interesting in terms of the ways in which these organizations can evolve. So these are big, complex organizations. There's 2 structures that I'm going to touch on here. There's what's called a flatarchy. A flatarchy is an interesting structure. It's obviously a mix between a flat structure and a hierarchical structure. This is used for R&D teams. A lot of organizations that have spin-off R&D teams or kind of skunkworks teams do this. What they'll do is they'll take a segment of their organization and they'll spin it out as a flat organization and have it run as a special project. And you see it a lot. It's really interesting as a you know, as an early stage company. If you were ever to land in a larger organization, being part of one of those flatarchy kind of skunkworks operations is really exciting because it really kind of gives you that feel of being kind of an originator and a founder, and it's a very flat kind of construct on how that works. There's also a holacratic organization, which is a very difficult organization to manage, but it's an organization which is just basically a whole bunch of flat organizations that are just all connected together. And so basically you're able to run 20 businesses in one. This is a tough organization to run. You have to have really clear rules, and even the CEO has to follow those rules, because otherwise you just end up literally creating 10 totally different companies. So you have to have a really good structure. Once you're in this, it's very difficult to get out of it. But there are some, Google is a good example of this. There are some great organizations that are able to really work this way and create really, really magnificent innovation. This is a real driver for innovation because every one of these teams is basically doing independent innovation. You know, you can imagine when you're maturing the amount of cultural challenges you have. Like, how do you get an organization of 1,000+ people or 10,000 or 100,000 people? It is all process. There is very limited personal touch anymore. Even in a growth organization, there is so much personal touch involved in making sure that your culture is translated to the people. But in this case, once you're mature, you know, that all goes away. You have to really build a construct that tries to manage that, and you have to, you know, build culture through marketing and branding and things that are really ethereal and outside of kind of your day-to-day work. So what I want to touch on real quick that's kind of the first half of conversation. And what I want to touch on really quickly is what is culture? And so I was kind of thinking about different ways to look at this and to structure this. And what's really interesting, I was looking at a Stanford study that was done. Actually, it was covered by a group here, a company called Bunch.ai, which does culture reviews here. I don't know if any of you guys know them, but they're based in Berlin, and the CEO wrote this article that I was reviewing, and it had a lot of really great content. So I borrowed some stuff off of that, which matched, which kind of ties into this Stanford study that I was looking at. And there's a few things in here which I thought were really interesting. A couple of quotes. So when you think about what culture is a social control system within a company that drives certain kinds of behaviors. So it's not, you can't touch it or feel it. It's just a system that manages the way people think in an organization. And there are 6 key, what are called norms, that really drive culture. There is adaptability, there are principles, there's result-oriented culture, detail-oriented culture, customer-oriented culture, and collaborative culture. So these are the 6 norms. But what's really interesting is if you really want a strong culture, you can only focus on 1 or 2. You can't focus on 6 different norms and think you're going to actually be effective. You focus on 1 or 2 norms, you prioritize the rest of the norms, and that's how you can think about, this is what I want my organization to be. So what I thought would be interesting, and you're not going to be able to read all this, but you can get it afterwards. I'll make sure that this is posted somewhere. But each of these has positives and negatives. Each of these has companies that specifically follow those cultures. Facebook's an adaptability culture. GitHub is detail-oriented. Netflix is results-oriented. Airbnb is customer-oriented. And what you can see is each of these companies, when you actually think about how they run their company and how they think about their company, you can actually look at the positives and negatives and things around each one of these key norms, and it makes sense. It makes sense that Airbnb is customer-oriented. That's what they think about. That's how they make all their decisions. Another one's customer-oriented is actually Amazon. It's interesting. Jeff Bezos always has the customer in the room every time they have a meeting. He leaves a chair empty, and that chair is the customer's chair, and everybody in the room has to include the customer in the conversation, and that's a customer-oriented culture. And so, it's interesting, it's strange. I mean, that's someone running a 100,000-person organization. How do you translate culture into that organization? You create a principle that there's always an empty chair in every room, and that makes everybody think, and so then you're driving that culture. So I thought this was super interesting because it really starts to tell you how to think about that. So I implore you, all of your companies, whether you're owning it, running it, or even working within it, think about what you are. Think about which one of these you fit into, or versus which one you want to fit into. And sometimes you're obligated to be a certain cultural type at a certain stage of your business. And so, as an example of that, where are we? So right now we're a hierarchy, as you can imagine. We're a growth organization. We've started to build really deep focus and deep vertical capabilities. And we are a combination of customer-oriented and collaborative. Now, collaborative is a necessity because transitioning to this organization, we could only do it if we could make sure there was really good collaboration between the teams. So we built a lot of real detailed structures, and we kind of built a remote culture that allowed all the remote employees to collaborate and be part of every meeting. And we built a really, really strong collaborative culture. We're customer-oriented because we want to make sure, what is our differentiation? Our differentiation is the customer experience, is the way we build our platform to actually really make it work for developers. If we're not focused on that developer and what that developer wants, then we're not going to be building the right products. So we have to be customer-oriented, we have to be collaborative. What does that mean? If I go back, that means we want to be results-oriented, we want to be detail-oriented, we want to be adaptable because that's the most innovative opportunity. But the reality is we have to prioritize those. And to us, collaboration and customer orientation are the highest priorities. Once collaboration is handled and we don't have that issue anymore, do we move ourselves towards result orientation or do we move ourselves towards adaptability? We have the option, and this is not easy, but we have the opportunity to transition the culture to what we want it to be. But at least when you start, you're thinking about, hey, what's right for me right now? How do I want my team to think? If you've got one half of your organization thinking about principles and the other half of the organization thinking about detail orientation, and then a third part of the organization thinking about results orientation, you're going to have a lot of conflict in your organization. So you have to think about what it is that you want to be. The Stanford Study actually, and you know, adaptable culture is not an easy thing to build. But the Stanford organization actually did do their study on adaptability. And they said that they found the organizations, and obviously Facebook is a good example of this. We found organizations that had strong norms for adaptability that were strongly held. These organizations perform much better in terms of net income growth, revenue growth, and market to book value of the company. So adaptability is obviously very powerful. The next slide is probably an obvious one. If you have a strong culture, you grow. If you have a weak culture, there's going to come a point where you crash. And so it always is important to think about culture in every stage of the growth of your business to make sure that you're still retaining, you know, the integrity of the company that you're building. And so what have we covered today? We talked about various different structures, an ad hoc flat structure, flatter hierarchy, flatter key holocratic. The first three you're going to go through just as you go through the phases of growth in your business. The last two start becoming, you know, these complex organizational structures that you think about as you're in a much larger organization. And in culture, we talk about the 6 norms: adaptability, principles, results-oriented, detail-oriented, customer-oriented, and collaborative. And those cultures, you have to figure out 1 or 2 of those cultures that are really the right ones for you. Focus on building your team around those, and then prioritize the rest to make sure that you're making your decisions with that in mind. And with that being said, I'd like to thank you for being patient and listening to that all. And I already answered the question about the CTO, so any other questions, I am more than happy to cover off on.
I can give you this one. Thanks a lot. Anyone? Yeah.
That was great. Thank you very much. My question is, obviously Christmas 2014 was horrible for some leaders at DigitalOcean. How did you prioritize? Obviously you showed us the solution you did, the end result, but what was the process like? How did you, yeah, it
was interesting. I mean, with us, and you know, I'm bearing my soul here for you guys, so you know, nothing is rosy all the time. There's always going to be bad times for every company. So owning that actually is the best way to learn. You know, we got to a point where you know, you don't react right away. It's not like you see the first sign of a problem. You're like, oh my God, there's going to be a problem. Let's do all these changes. Things get bad. And so we got to a point at the end of the year where literally our productivity had fallen through the floor. Like when you look at it as a point in time, you'd say, you know, we are in the worst state we can be as an operating organization. And so January came, we sat down as a leadership team. There were a lot of conflicts going on within the leadership team. And we just basically put the hammer down and say, hey, guys, we need to change something. We need to actually create a plan to improve this. Because if this keeps going for another 6 months, it doesn't matter how much revenue we're generating, how we're growing, this company's going to implode. We can't, it's not going to get any better. So it's just like in any problem you have, until you hit a critical point where you know that you're on like the edge of disaster, do you actually react and start saying, okay, now it's time to make changes. So we actually thought about it as a construct. We actually said, okay, what are the things? We built the construct in our heads and then started rolling it out. We did iterate, obviously, and change things as we went. You know, we did it in an agile way, as you would say. But I would say that we didn't like do little piece here and there. We created a full plan and said, we are going to improve communication. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to, you know, put culture back in the hands of the organization. This is what we're going to build to do that. We're going to create some level of management control over our engineering organization, because that was obviously the biggest group, so that there is some control and some structure. And we kind of said, here are all the pain points. Here's the way we're going to resolve them. Now let's go start doing it. And as we do it, we'll iterate and figure out what the best solution is. And it took us probably around 6 months before you could really say, put your finger on it and say, okay, this business is working again. And I'd say by the summer of 2015, we got back on the horse and started riding. And then as we went into 2016, productivity started going through the roof. And this year it's been fantastic. We released more products this year than we ever have in the history of the company. We've grown more significantly than we ever have historically. So it's just, and we think 2018 is going to be even stronger. So like it's a flywheel, but you have to kind of start with a plan and then just iterate and build from there.
Thank you so much for sharing. Cheers.
I guess right there.
Hey, I'm Robert. My question is about, I think 2014 it was, where you scaled the business from 20 to 120 people. would you do it again? And do you think it's possible with this kind of growth to keep a good productivity and culture within a team, or would you rather say then, okay, be slower?
I think you could do it. I mean, companies do it all the time. I think the mistake wasn't in growing that fast. The mistake was in not having thought of the plan or the structure by which it happens. I would hire differently. I would have hired managers first. I would have built some leveling in engineers, so I could differentiate between entry-level engineers and senior engineers we were hiring. With some of the things we ended up doing later, I would have done ahead of time to create a little bit of construct, not too much, because you're still too early to be totally process-oriented. But if you build a little bit of construct up front and you start the things that we ended up doing in 2015 and like early to mid 2014, you can handle it. 20 to 120 people is not like you're still talking to every individual. You still know everybody's name. You know, if it was 400 to 800, that's more difficult because you don't know everybody's name and you have very little control about who's coming in the doors. But when you're at 120 to 120, you can handle that growth. You just got to, I mean, I think our problem is we had a lot of conflicts at the founding team and at the executive team in terms of how to do it. So everybody was trying to do it a different way. And there was just no structure to it. So it was just a whole bunch of people that were kind of thrown in a pit and said, figure out how to work together. And at that size, you can't do it anymore.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Sasha. Two questions actually. One is, how did you prevent, or did you prevent classical silo effects when transitioning to this hierarchical organization? And second, why not skip the hierarchy on this stage of growth and transition more into a kind of more advanced organization already? So is the hierarchy actually necessary? It feels to me a little bit like a kind of regression because the problems are all known.
Yeah, it is. It is. So were there silo teams? Your first question. Yes, and they didn't survive. We built an SRE team, for example. A lot of the team came from GitHub. Another part of the team came from, I think, Oscar. So you had like these two different groups coming together. We had one leader we brought in, and they became completely siloed. And SRE is like the polar opposite of silo. SRE, you want fully integrated across your engineering group, but they became completely siloed. And they didn't last. There was a huge cultural problem. I think at this point, not a single person that was in that original team is still with the company. But a team of 12 people fell down to 2 people in that period at the end of 14 and early 15 because of attrition, because everyone was just clearly unhappy. And so the silo teams did happen, but they didn't last. And I think that taught us very quickly that we cannot let a team get siloed. Communication and collaboration had to be a major component of how we introduce teams in the future because it was the only way to actually make it work. And so then as we built DevOps teams and kind of these replacement organizations for SRE, we were able to actually build much more integrated activities, and the silo effect went away. But at that early stage, when you're hiring so many people and you start getting these clusters of people that come from the same companies, they all know each other, they gravitate together, and then now they become a silo. So yes, absolutely. In terms of your second question,
Sorry. That would mean that also you had kind of cultural silos in the organization. So was a kind of no cultural alignment there.
Yes.
Due to that.
Yeah, and that's part of what I was talking about in terms of you having to drive the culture rather than letting the employees bring whatever culture they bring with them. Because if people come in and create their own culture, you're going to end up with pockets of different cultures. And that was part of the conflict that we saw. So from that, we realized, hey, everybody comes in, it's got to be part of DigitalOcean. Doesn't matter where you came from. If you're part of this family, you're part of this family. And that's been really successful for us ever since. So now we're in a situation where everybody wants to step up and help everybody else because we all think of each other as family. So it becomes, and we're in the family, so that's a pun, but it becomes a very comfortable environment where you can go and ask anybody for help, and people are always going to be willing to stand up and help you. So yeah, cultural silos as much as team silos would kind of be created that way. In terms of skipping hierarchy, because it's a step back, but actually it is a necessary step back. When you go to these holacratic and flattery type structures, and more complex structures, you have to be so disciplined and have so much organization. Otherwise, it just spins completely out of control. And you cannot get that coming straight from a flatter structure. What hierarchy does is it allows you to build process. It allows you to create a system that ingests the way in which the company is going to grow. When you have a successful hierarchy, you're then able to start spinning off little pieces of it and creating a flatterarchy, for example, and then eventually evolving the structure to be much more autonomous. But if you went straight from one to the other, you would probably have a disaster because you would miss the whole step of creating process and control and rules and guidelines and making sure that there's true alignment in the business. And I think that also the holacratic and the flatterarchy structures are less effective with only 200-300 people. They become more, because those teams alone could be 30-40 people. And so they become more effective when you actually get to 1,000, 2,000 people, because when a 30-40 person spins off and does their own thing, it doesn't affect the culture of the whole company. But when you have 30-40 people leaving a 30-person company to go do their own thing, it becomes a very strange cultural shift. I think a great example of that is actually the Macintosh when Steve Jobs went off and created a whole Skunkworks team to build the Macintosh separate to Apple completely, and you saw a total kind of shift in culture between his organization, his Skunkworks group, and the rest of Apple as a company.
One more thing, sorry.
Okay.
There's a lot of talk about ambidexterity recently, especially for larger organizations that struggle with innovation and especially with crossing the gap between innovation and the operating business. How did you deal with that? Or did you deal with that?
With
like keeping the operating business uninterrupted, scaling it, making it more efficient, and on the other hand, introducing a new layer of innovation that feeds into the...
Yeah, that's tough. That's really tough. You come from a place where it's all innovation, and then you start putting process in, you have to create structure. I think what we've been able to do... Oh, we can close that, yeah. I think what we've been able to do is we've been able to innovation. So let's back up again. Take that out. Yeah, what we've been able to do, I think, is we've been able to actually identify the plan of where we're going in the business, and then we've actually started to try and build components of our teams that are innovation focused. So, building an R&D team and building, senior architects in our engineering group that are focused on innovation. And sometimes it's big horizontal innovation, like market innovation. Sometimes it's very focused innovation in terms of how do we deal with a performance problem in the kernel of compute, and do we innovate a very new solution to do that? And we've been relatively effective at that, but it's had to be very, very designed. I mean, when you go to hierarchy, innovation does slow down, and you have to be very conscious about that and very conscious about building that. I think that our plate is full in terms of the things that we need to build. So we're busy, so that's good. We are not innovating at the pace we were innovating 2 years ago. I believe that in the next year or two, we will get back to innovating at that kind of pace. But we have to go through the process we're going through now to create the stability and the structure that we need to be able to compete into the future. But it is a problem. You slow down, and I think it's frustrating, especially for founders, because they come from world innovation. But it's something you have to deal with as part of growth.
See a question over there.
Hi, my name is Torben. My question is, among those 6 cultural norms that you addressed, by which process do you actually prioritize among them? How do you avoid the trap of always going back to no, we also want to be adaptable, and how do you take the decision and who takes it?
Yeah, starts at the top. It's funny that we fell into what we're doing without that framework. And then when we look at that framework, we understand where we are. Because I think inherently no one can focus on 6 things. And as a leader, your natural decision is always going to be, hey, team, focus. Like, you want to go over there and be adaptable, but no, we've got to focus on what we're thinking about now. And right now, the only thing that matters is the customer. or the only thing that matters is that we collaborate well. And so you inherently move into one of those if you're managing well. Creating the framework is just a nice way for people to be able to actually think about it. So, with that framework, we can take people who maybe don't naturally focus as effectively as you'd want them to, and be able to say, okay, here's a framework, decide what you need and what you need to be. But I do think it has to be a conscious decision. I think you have to actually decide this is what this company needs to perform. And it is painful because we have conversations, at the leadership table, where we're saying, hey, we need to be results oriented. We need to be able to get our KPIs, and we need to be able to deliver this and deliver that. But at the end of the day, we know that we are going to be driven by, customer orientation and collaboration first. And that, in some cases, affects results because there is a shorter-term goal that we have to achieve before we can get to the point that we start really thinking purely about results. But, you have to also think about, how do I transition? Or what stage of this business do I feel like I need to change the way people think? Because, right now the way we're thinking is slowing us down in a way that's hurting us.
If I just may, a second question. Sure. How do you keep motivation high among your best people while you're scaling up the team, and you place even better people or people who manage those people because they lack the management skill set on top of them?
So it's really interesting. The best people have the highest respect for people that are better. And actually, one interesting test when you interview people is people who know that they can always be better and there's always opportunity to grow and they want to learn are generally going to be your best people. And those people, if you bring someone in who truly is, a master in what they know and what they do, those best people will see that as an opportunity to continue to grow. So what we found is our best people are always growing. We have career paths for them. They know where they're going. They know what their opportunities in the future. But you bring an architect above them who has done unbelievable things in their life, and you say this architect is going to mentor you and help you grow and become better, those best people will gravitate to that and will make that work. The real toughest challenge is the middle ground, where you have someone who's good at what they do and effective, but obviously wants to grow the business but doesn't have the capability to do the next level of work, and you have to bring someone in above them. This isn't your best person. This is just a cog in the wheel that is very strong. And you bring in someone above them, and they're always this challenge of, hey, why aren't I good enough to be that? And that's a leadership challenge. You have to be able to speak to those people and get them to buy into the idea that life is a learning lesson. I learn every day. We all learn every day. None of us are perfect. And the minute you think that you can do every job without learning, then you're not going to perform at your best.
Hi, my name is Harsh. I had one question related to, do you have an open door policy? So can anyone just skip a level or go and knock on anyone's door and ask a question, present an idea, or talk about something they don't feel is right?
No, we don't allow that at all.
What are your thoughts on it?
No one's allowed to talk to me. I got 4 people who report to me. That's all I talk to. No, absolutely. Total open door policy. We have a complete open plan set up. We have, the executives do have offices, but they're glass offices with double wide sliding doors that are open all the time. The only reason there are offices there is because we're constantly in meetings all day, and either we're going to be in a meeting room all day long or we're going to sit at our desk. And so it just, for convenience sake, it made more sense to have a space that we could just use all day long. But generally, everything's wide open. And this is the collaborative culture. We build a culture that says, talk to anybody you want at any time. And I have, whether it's bumping into someone in the hallway or someone just grabbing 15 minutes or half an hour of my time, or people just pinging me because they have a particular problem they want my input on, all the time. Total open door policy. It's interesting because there's going to come a point where that can't really happen as easily anymore. But right now, we're in a stage of the business where actually it's really effective.
Because in certain startups, you have not more than 100, 200 people, and when we talk about being a super open startup, but when you actually do go and approach someone, some people get upset about it, and I was wondering how you can possibly convince them that.
Yeah, I mean, because people feel like you're stepping on their toes and stuff like. It's a cultural thing. I think it is a matter of setting it up that way from the beginning, it's got to start at the top. It's got to start at the leadership level, and it's got to be about the relationships of each level with the level below and above them. So my relationship with my VPs is that, I talk to them, I talk to their team. We work collaboratively. We're a team. I don't work with them as though I'm their boss. I'm working with them as though I'm their partner. And in doing so, it allows a much more open communication with different levels in the organization. I think it's just become something natural and normal for us. If at 100 to 200 people, you're seeing that as a problem now, and I don't know what role you play, whether it's an executive role or an operating role in the business, but whatever that role is, this is the time in the size of the company, if you think that's a bad cultural position, to change it. Because if it doesn't change and you grow and you hire more leaders that are ingrained into this kind of, layered structure that doesn't allow communication, then that's going to be very difficult to get out of. But at 100 to 200 people, you're still in the stage where you can really change the way that works. You just, leadership has to be behind it and has to start at the very top.
Cool. Okay, there's a question here. Right.
Hi, I'm Judith. I'm a talent acquisition manager, and I'm wondering, I guess in the beginning you were all recruiting together when you were just 5 people or something?
Yes. Now we have a huge talent acquisition team.
At what point did you start introducing talent acquisition team or recruiters?
I think we started actually when we went from 20 to 120. One of our first hires was a recruiter, and we were like, hey, we need someone to come in and manage this flow. So as soon as we went into hypergrowth, we brought in talent acquisition specialists.
How big is your team now?
The talent acquisition team in total, including like operations and stuff like that, is probably around, I'd say about 10 to 12 people now. 10 people maybe. I'm not sure exact number, but somewhere around 10 to 12 people.
Thank you.
Let's try this side of the room. Who's got a question here? Or maybe I can leave you alone. It's up to you. Anyone? It's your
I think this side is winning.
It's your chance. I'm gonna go back and forth.
One quick question. You're obviously in meetings all day, and I come from a similar company which is a lot smaller, and we always had the challenge that the coders, the engineers, they spent you needed a red light, sort of warning light, to tell them you're having too many meetings. Have you had that challenge?
Yes, absolutely. I have a challenge with that every day myself, because I don't feel like I can get any work done, and there's a lot of things that I feel like I need to do outside of meeting with people. It is a challenge, and the larger the organization gets, this is where autonomy starts becoming more and more important. Let teams do their own thing. If you have everyone involved in every meeting, which is what happens when you're a smaller organization, totally happens when you're an ad hoc organization. Everyone is in every meeting. When you're a flatter organization, it can still happen because you're always pulling in these cross-functional people that you think can be helpful. And when you start getting really verticalized, as you go down to the IC, to the individual contributor, like team level, the meetings start becoming, localized scrums and things like that. You have less big cross-functional meetings. And then as you move up the organization, you have more cross-functional meetings, because that's where the collaboration really is driven. But it's a constant problem. And it's something we talk about a lot with our leaders, is like, look at your, every now and then, every 6 months, look at your weekly schedule and start evaluating where you're spending your time. And if you don't need to be in a meeting, get out of it, because people begin to struggle. You come into the work, you do 8 hours of meetings, and then you have to do your work. And that's, that becomes a 16-hour day, and that's not easy for anyone to handle. So yeah, it's a common problem.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take guy who's been standing for the entire
Hi, because you're saying you want to learn every day. What are your sources to learn, especially about culture and about like structure? Like what you would also recommend someone to read to become a better feeling of what's going on there?
Well, there's a long list of books out there for sure. There's a long list of books. I'll say reading gives me a certain amount of learning, and when I think of it that way, it's about reading about other people's experiences, because I don't think it's the reading, it's the experiences. And the way I would extend that is to say, all the VPs and even the directors that I've hired and work with, and even the other executives that are in the executive team in the company, all people I learn from. I wouldn't hire a VP if I didn't think I could learn something from them, because the whole point is that they have more of a specialty skill set in the area that they understand than I would. And so I've really gained a huge amount from all the people I surround myself with. I have mentors, industry mentors that I'm friendly with, that I have built personal relationships with, that I'll throw, you know, my problems on their table every now and then and just say, you know, tell me what do you think, tell me what to do. And then with books, there's a lot of great books. We should probably like print out a DigitalOcean book list, because we give Kindles to everyone in the company, and we have a really strong reading list that we provide. Actually, that's an interesting blog we should do, like the startup business reading list. And you know what, maybe we'll do that. Maybe I'll write that blog and get it out to everybody that came here today. But starting to go through the list of names, I'm going to draw a blank, and I'm going to lose that.
And then like a second question, you probably know the book from Google, Work.
Yes.
The interesting thing about that, like how they interpreted management and how they describe management and like think about management, seems to be different from your point of view. At least it came over like that.
Yeah.
Can you
They have a different culture to our culture, that's for sure. They approach things a little differently. I mean, they're a much larger organization now, but they started probably differently to the way we've started.
So you think, like I was thinking you can, like what Google thinks is like that the management level is just a service level for the sub levels. So I was thinking you can put this way of doing it to all organizations, or would you doubt that? So
Google is a holacratic organization. So what that means is the real work all gets done in those pods. And every team is an autonomous team that runs itself. When you have that, when I showed you that organization, there was no leadership level. Now, it doesn't mean leadership and executives don't exist. They do. But it is, you know, they literally create and manage the rules as a service organization. And all the different teams run by those rules and operate totally autonomously. You can't do that in a organization our size. If you were able to do that, you'd have to be incredibly skilled to be able to do that, especially, you know, because the amount of people you're hiring are so many more than the amount of people you have. And when you're filling these individual teams, it starts becoming very, very difficult to manage the growth and manage the way you build your business. As you become more mature, it kind of goes to a question asked earlier, like, do you have to go through hierarchy to get to a holacratic structure? I believe you do. I think if we go to north of 1,000 people and we have a lot of the boxes ticked in terms of how we run things, beginning to spin off groups and beginning to move towards a holacracy is a very reasonable approach. That's Google's approach. But when Google started, you know, Google went through the same growth that just happened in the late 90s. So everything you read about Google is already at the point where they've gone beyond, you know, the things I've talked about today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we can take one last question, maybe. Oh, over there. Can you guys talk to each other and combine your questions?
You guys can share a question.
Let's get a better one.
Thank you. We actually work in the same company, so it will be okay. Good. Thank you for the presentation. Just have two very quick questions. The first one would be, we have our office, our main office in Zurich, and now we have the second office in Berlin. And we also have some remote people working abroad and some freelancers. So how do you ensure that culture stays the same within all these different...
That's a great question. And is that your first, second, or both questions? Okay. So we are exactly the same. Half our organization, actually out of 400 people, probably 150 to 160 are actually in the New York headquarters. We now have an office in Boston. We have an office in India. We have 20 people in California. We have 5 people here in Germany. We have, you know, remote people all across the world. And we have like these concentrations in areas where we're building satellite offices, but generally we have, you know, people around the world. What we did is, this is part of our 2015 kind of cultural approach. And actually, if anyone gets a chance to speak to Jessica, who is here, who is runs our people experience function, she was a key driver in kind of going through this whole process and getting us through it, is we recognized that as we were hiring, we were finding better and better talent remotely. And so we wanted to build an environment that allowed us to collaborate with remote employees in a way that made them feel very engaged with the business. A huge amount of culture is communicated on the onboarding process. We bring them in for 2 weeks. We get them really engaged. We give them a full onboarding package. We talked about the vision, the culture, what we're trying to do, get them really up to speed. And then what we've built is an environment where, we built a whole new office where everything is fully integrated for remote employees. So every room has conferencing in it. Every room is set up to share and work communally with remote and local employees. It was just all really set up in a way that engaged remote employees to be part of the business. And what's really interesting is Antoine, who's an engineer with us, who's here as well, he happens to somehow be everywhere in the world that I end up being, and I don't know how it happens, but I think he's stalking me. But you know, he's a great example of a remote employee that's actually traveling around the world and working very effectively for us from wherever he is, because we've built a culture that allows for that. We do more than that. Jessica does a great job of this. Like everything we do in office, we figure out a way to translate that for the remote employee. If we're doing an event where people get something in office, a care package goes to every employee to match that event. If we do our AMA, we have set up a huge area of our office. We actually started, even our first office, we had a tiny little area. But we created an area where we have full conferencing in, everybody conferences in, and everybody's part of that same meeting together. And even when we do things like these recognitions at every AMA meeting we have with the company, where people recognize other people's contributions. Half of them are read from in the room, half of them are read remotely from remote employees. Like every little piece that we do engages the remote employee as though they're physically in the room with you. So again, you got to be very disciplined and very focused on making that work. But if you can make that work, it becomes very powerful, because from a scaling capability, you're able to scale remotely, and you're able to build a wide team pretty remotely. In terms of offices, when we built the Boston office, we essentially took all of the themes and design from our New York office and replicated as much of it as we could in the Boston office, so that the people feel like, even though it was a different office, they were in the same environment. So again, it promoted. And then we did things like, we do meetups in our office in New York. We started doing them in Boston as well. We got a local office manager that was able to kind of take all of the principles of how we were running culture in our New York office and replicating them in our Boston office. And Jessica and I have already had conversations about how we need to do that in India, we need to do that in Berlin, we need to do that in California, and anywhere else that we want to open offices, so that we have these representatives that just focus on making sure that the experience for people in those areas matches the experience that we're offering in New York.
Cool. Just quick last question. You spoke about key results. We've been struggling a lot setting our OKRs, reading a lot of best practices from Google every quarter and so on. And my question would be, on which period basis do you set your key results, and on how many key results can one focus?
Yeah, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. We're going through it now for 2018. So what we do is we build annualized objectives. We usually have 3 or 4. This year we have 4, and I think we're going to go to 3 this coming year. Big macro objectives, like this is what we want to do as an objective. Each objective has 3 to 5 key results associated with it. So in Q3 to Q4 is where we set that. So in the next, we're actually going through the process now, and probably by the end of November, we're going to have, our objectives already set. We'll have all our key results set within them. 3 objectives, 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 key results under each objective. Every key result is what we call SMART. It's an anagram, and I'm not going to kind of like give you the exact definition, but it's basically measurable and actionable and all these kind of different components. And so every key result has metric associated with it and is measurable. So what we do is we set that for the year. As soon as we set that for the year, we then think on a quarterly basis, what do we need to do this quarter to achieve that? So the objectives never change, but the key results are broken down by quarter. So at the end of this quarter, what we do is a QBR, quarterly business review. It takes all the leadership. We go off-site for a day, and we talk about all the things that we want to achieve to get to this objective, and it's done very collaboratively. So every key result that we come up with, it might have multiple teams involved in it. But we basically, prepare ahead of time, but in that one day set out, these are the key results for the quarter, and then we come back and communicate it to the company. We track them every month, and then at the end of the quarter, we do a review of those, and then we set the ones for the following quarter. So we set objectives annually with macro key results annually, and then quarterly key results for every quarter, so we can track how we're developing towards our end goals.
Does the key result change as well, or is it only the measure change?
The key result changes, because some key results are achievable in a different time frame, and your focus changes because you realize, hey, we've got this side covered. We need to now turn the focus of the business in a different way. Otherwise, if you have the same key result for a whole year, after 9 months, sometimes you're like, why are we still doing this? It's irrelevant. And so you have to iterate and be willing to adjust that. We don't change them within the quarter because we want to give enough breathing room for people to actually be able to execute.
Cool. Thank you very much, Karl. I'd love to hear a big round of applause.
Que la famille